Tonight, when you're hungry, you'll open a fridge. Cold air, fresh food, 100 choices, no thought required. But rewind 1,000 years to a Viking longhouse in the middle of a Scandinavian winter, and that same hunger could mean the difference between life and death. Because for the Vikings, survival wasn't decided by the sword. It was decided months earlier, in autumn, by what they managed to hide from time itself. Forget the image of Viking warriors tearing into giant slabs of roasted meat around a roaring fire. That picture is mostly Hollywood. The real Viking diet was something far stranger, far more disciplined, and far more brilliant than any feast scene ever showed you. It was a system built entirely around one enemy: the dark, frozen months when nothing grew, nothing swam close to shore, and the sun barely rose at all. So what did they actually eat when the world froze over? The answer is a story about chemistry, engineering, and just how far the human body can be pushed before it breaks. Let's start with the real weapon behind Viking survival. Not iron, not steel, preservation. By early autumn, every Viking farm was racing against a clock. Livestock had to be slaughtered before the first hard frost because there wasn't enough stored hay to keep a full herd alive through winter. This was not a small decision. It meant permanently reducing the size of your herd based on a calculated guess about how harsh the coming months would be. Guess wrong, and you'd either starve your animals or starve your family. There was no room for sentiment in that math. Once an animal was slaughtered, almost nothing was wasted. Meat, organs, blood, even bone were all put to use. But the real challenge wasn't the killing. It was making that meat last for 6 months without a single refrigerator, freezer, or can. The Vikings solved this with 3 overlapping techniques: salting, smoking, and drying, each exploiting a different weakness in bacteria's ability to survive. Salt was the most effective method, but it came at a brutal cost. Salt had to be imported from the south or painstakingly evaporated from seawater over open fires, which made it one of the most expensive substances a Viking family could own. Historians have nicknamed it white gold, for good reason. When salt was available, meat was packed tightly into wooden barrels, layer after layer, until the salt drew every trace of moisture out of the flesh. What was left behind was an environment where bacteria simply could not survive. Salted meat, stored properly, could last almost indefinitely, but not every household could afford enough salt. So they turned to smoke. Longhouses had no chimneys, which meant thick smoke from the central hearth naturally rose and filled the space under the roof. Instead of treating that smoke as a nuisance, Vikings turned it into a preservation chamber. Strips of meat and fish were hung directly in that smoke for weeks, sometimes months. The smoke slowly dried the flesh, while depositing chemical compounds that killed bacteria and repelled insects. By midwinter, the underside of a longhouse roof looked less like a ceiling and more like a pantry. And then there was the strangest, most ingenious method of all: turning fish into something closer to wood. In the far north, particularly around the Lofoten Islands, massive schools of Arctic cod moved close to shore every winter between January and April. Vikings gutted the fish, tied them in pairs by the tail, and hung them over wooden frames to face the open air. No salt, no smoke, just freezing temperatures and constant wind. Over 3 to 4 months, the cold air pulled nearly 80% of the moisture out of each fish, leaving behind something so dense and dehydrated it could be swung like a club. This dried fish, known as stockfish, could be stored for years without spoiling, and it became one of the most valuable trade goods in the entire Norse world. Crews on long voyages to Iceland and Greenland relied on it because it was light, calorie-dense, and virtually indestructible. Grain was the quieter hero of Viking survival, and it's easy to overlook because it isn't dramatic. But barley, the hardiest crop that could survive rocky northern soil, was the true backbone of the winter diet. It was ground into flour for dense, flat bread, boiled into thick porridge, and fermented into ale, which functioned less like a recreational drink and more like a daily calorie source. In a world where well water could carry disease, the boiling process required to brew ale actually made it safer to drink than water itself. Dairy filled in the gaps that grain and meat couldn't. Milk spoiled within a day, so it was transformed almost immediately into something shelf-stable. The most important of these was skyr, a thick, protein-dense soft cheese made by slowly fermenting milk and draining the whey. Unlike fresh milk, skyr could sit in a cool cellar for weeks without spoiling, giving families a reliable source of protein exactly when fresh meat was running low. Even the leftover whey wasn't wasted. Its acidity made it useful for preserving cooked meats, stretching supplies even further. Then there was butter, treated less like a condiment and more like stored energy. In summer, when cows produced rich milk, surplus was immediately churned into butter and prepared for winter. If salt was available, it was heavily salted. If not, Vikings used a method that sounds almost unbelievable today. They packed the butter into wooden barrels, or wrapped it in bark and buried it in peat bogs. The cold, oxygen-poor, acidic environment of a bog acted as a natural preservative so effective that buried butter could remain edible for years, even decades. Here's the part almost nobody talks about. When salting and drying weren't enough, or when the weather made proper drying impossible, Vikings turned to something that sounds less like cooking and more like early biochemistry, controlled decay. Fermentation let them preserve food that would otherwise be dangerous or inedible. The most extreme example was hakarl, made from Greenland shark, an animal whose flesh is actually toxic when fresh due to high concentrations of urea. To make it safe, the shark was buried in gravel for weeks, allowing the toxic fluids to slowly drain out, then hung to air dry for several more months. What started as poison became a stable, edible source of protein in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Fermented trout and the early ancestors of fermented herring worked on the same underlying principle, using just enough salt to prevent rot while encouraging the exact right kind of bacterial fermentation. Root vegetables like turnips and early carrot varieties were packed in sand or moss inside dark cellars, where they could last until spring without rotting. Wild hazelnuts, gathered by the sackful in autumn, offered a dense source of fat and protein that stayed edible in their shells for years. Berries were harder to preserve than nuts, but Vikings found ways around that too, drying them in the sun or simply submerging them in cold water inside sealed barrels, where their natural acidity kept them fresh enough to flavor porridge months later. And when even careful planning wasn't enough, when a long winter stretched past its limits and stores ran dangerously low, Vikings faced what historians sometimes call the hunger gap. This usually struck in late winter and early spring, the exact moment when autumn's harvest was long gone and nothing new had grown yet. In the most desperate stretches, people stripped the inner bark from pine and elm trees, dried it, and ground it into a bitter, barely digestible flour that was mixed into what little real flour remained just to fill the stomach and buy a few more days of survival. When even bark ran out, dried roots, moss, and lichen were boiled down into whatever calories they could yield. It wasn't nourishment in any real sense. It was a stalling tactic against starvation, bought one meager meal at a time. What's striking is that despite all of this hardship, bioarchaeological studies of Viking-era skeletons have found surprisingly little evidence of chronic malnutrition. Isotope analysis of preserved remains suggests that even in the leanest months, the sheer variety of preservation techniques, grain, dairy, fish, meat, foraged plants was usually enough to keep serious nutrient deficiencies at bay. The system wasn't glamorous, but it worked more often than it failed. It's also worth remembering that this same scarcity is exactly why Yule, the midwinter feast that would later shape modern Christmas traditions, mattered so much. Held during the darkest, coldest stretch of the year, Yule wasn't a celebration of abundance. It was a deliberate decision to spend down precious reserves, slaughtering a boar or opening a barrel of mead, specifically because the community needed something to hold on to in the middle of the hardest weeks. A 12-day festival powered entirely by supplies that were never meant to be touched until spring. Now think about your own kitchen. A refrigerator that keeps meat edible for weeks, a freezer that can hold food for months without a single thought about bacteria, salt, or smoke. Most of us throw away food that's a single day past its expiration date, food that a Viking family would have fought through an entire winter to protect. We've made preservation so effortless that we've forgotten it was ever a matter of survival at all. The Vikings didn't survive their winters because they were fearless warriors. They survived because someone, months earlier, made the unglamorous decision to salt one more barrel of meat, smoke one more strip of fish, or bury one more block of butter in a bog. Every dried fish, every barrel of skyr, every grain of imported salt was a quiet bet against the dark. And for most families, that bet paid off. The next time you open your fridge without a second thought, remember that behind that convenience is 300,000 years of a much harder question. What happens when winter comes and there is nothing left to eat?